Good evening. I'm Charles Milliken, the Vice President for Spiritual Care and Values Integration for the Houston Methodist System. I also serve as the Executive Sponsor to Biomedical Ethics for the Houston Methodist programs. It's indeed my privilege to welcome you here this evening to Houston Methodist, and for those of you from out of town, welcome to Houston. We're glad that you're here. But this is a dream come true for us, to be able to honor truly one of the great philosophers and theologians of our time in Dr. Baruch Brody. He was very special to me. As you would expect, I am an ordained Methodist clergyman, a pastor of large churches for the most part, but 15 years ago found my way here to Houston Methodist. And when I came, I learned that there was a lot I needed to learn. And Baruch Brody was someone, and yes, Lord, I'm here. But what I also need you to know is that I will forever be indebted to this great man. He has given me a life and a presence that, quite frankly, can never, ever be estimated in any value at all, except truly greatness. And so it's indeed a privilege to be united with both Baylor College of Medicine and the Department of Philosophy at Rice University to create the first annual Baruch Brody Award, recognizing one of the finest young biomedical ethicists in our country. And that's what we did with you, Holly. We're very glad that you're here. And so we welcome you to Houston. We welcome you to this conference and this lecture and to the evening that will be truly transformative. It's now my privilege to introduce Dr. Timothy Schroeder, who's the chair of the Department of Philosophy at Rice University. Previously, he was at the University of Manitoba and Ohio State University. Prior to coming to Rice, he has his PhD from Stanford. He's the author of 3 books, and he is someone who certainly is a rising star in this world of philosophy as well. Dr. Schroeder.
Thank you for all being here. It's wonderful and a privilege to be standing here in front of you representing the philosophy department at Rice. We were so fortunate to have Baruch be such a powerful institutional force for so many years. He arrived to the department in 1975 with the instructions, more or less in these words, according to the legend: shake this place up and make something out of it. And it's fantastic to report that A, he did, B, we're doing our best to continue the legacy that he handed to us. It's impossible to adequately say everything that should be said about Baruch. As a philosopher, therefore, I will not attempt to do the impossible, but I'll say one thing that I particularly noticed when there was an outpour of memorial thoughts after he passed away. One of the things I particularly noticed was there was this common theme from those who had known him in an institutional role, that he was the person who could get people to compromise. Was the person who could get people to come together, to agree, to find a position that met the interest as much as possible of everybody at stake, that everybody would sit around and say, you know, you're right, we can get this done together. And here we all are together. And that's a fantastic tribute to that specific spirit of Baruch. One last story from me. When I came to Rice, it was already 2015, and the man who had built and shaped the universe was a friendly older guy in a sweater vest. And he would occasionally offer some thoughts. He would say, well, you know, if you want my opinion, you know, you could think about this or this, but really, this is for you folks to figure out. Meaning us, the newly hired generation, the up-and-coming generation of the department. Well, here we are talking about medical ethics, and it's for us to figure out. So good luck to us. It's my pleasure now to welcome to the podium Dina Brody.
Thank you again, Tim. It's good to see all of you again. I would like to introduce our family, our sons Todd and Jeremy's wife Rocky. Our third son, Miles, is unable to be here this evening because he is flying as we speak with his wife Rocky and kids to his brother-in-law's wedding. Todd's wife Ellen is at trial in New York, and our 13 grandchildren are all over the world, in Israel, Thailand, Maryland, New Jersey, and in a Boston-bound airplane. The timing of this award in my husband's memory made me think about why 3 prestigious institutions, Baylor, Methodist, and Rice, would honor Baruch's memory almost 8 years after he stopped being director of the center here at Baylor, and 2 years after he retired from Rice. What was there about Baruch, this guy with the unpronounceable name, that made him this beloved, unforgettable man on campus? Of course, his academic achievements and research made him famous, but it was his extraordinary humanity and character that made him the remarkable and treasured person he was. Above everything else, Baruch was a teacher. He could never understand how people became university professors and then did everything they could not to teach. He loved to impart knowledge and to see that special light in his students' eyes when they got it. I am forever grateful to Dr. Ralph Feigen, of blessed memory, who, when Baruch was offered the presidency of another prestigious university, convinced him that he would be lost without his being able to teach, and let Baruch follow him around on his daily schedule so he could see for himself that this wasn't the life he was cut out for. He never, in over 53 years of teaching, used the same curriculum twice. It was so important to him that his students enjoyed his classes, and that #1 evaluation meant everything to him. One would think after so many years teaching that he wouldn't worry about this anymore, which leads me to his next trait, his humility. Baruch always strove to be the best he could be, yet even when everyone else acknowledged that he achieved his goals, he would never accept the fact that he had made it to the top as a teacher or as a father. This award in your memory, Baruch, shows that and proves that you did make it to the top, and your children and grandchildren can attest to the fact that you were the best father and grandfather, bar none. Baruch was the most brilliant man I ever met. His range of knowledge was stupendous, and his ability to comprehend complex minutiae in a wide variety of fields was, to say the least, mind-boggling. He was a voracious reader and could weave together complex ideas from many sources. What was more astounding was his ability to simplify these complex ideas and explain them to others. He was always down to earth and very practical. He never made his friends or his students feel like they weren't up to his intellectual level. He would talk to them and answer their questions at whatever level they were. He would write papers with junior colleagues, and even when the initial ideas were his, he would let the junior colleague develop the paper and let him or her get credit for being the lead writer. He knew he had enough writings to his credit and wanted to give junior faculty the chance to flourish. He was just a regular guy who loved to grocery shop, listen to music, read detective novels, and go to the movies, ballet, and opera. He was a huge fan of a wide range of TV shows, from Game of Thrones to Storage Wars, American Pickers, and Salvage Dogs. We loved to travel, and after Baruch received a kidney from Jeremy, we made a bucket list and proceeded to check off every location on it. He was a loyal friend and a very kind man. I can't even count how many friends came over to me after he died to tell me how he had helped them deal with a dying relative and how compassionate and helpful he was. Baruch didn't tell jokes. He told funny stories that illustrated what he was trying to convey. His students always commented about his sense of humor and how much they enjoyed his stories, which were really one of his great teaching tools. He made learning fun and got his point across. But Baruch was much more than just a terrific teacher. He was a leader. It has been said that good leaders create followers. Great leaders create more leaders. Baruch knew how to lead, but he also knew how to nurture leadership. He also knew when to leave the stage and hand over the reins to the leaders he had fostered. And he knew how to let the young leadership make their own mistakes and not to hover over them. Here at the center, when Baruch decided he had done everything he had set out to do and felt that fresh leadership was needed to bring this center to new heights, he retired and left the center in the very capable hands of Amy McGuire, who had trained under him and learned from him. He was thrilled, absolutely thrilled with Amy's accomplishments at the center and felt that she had succeeded in reaching goals he had only aspired to. And last of all, but certainly not least, and this is what Tim said too, was his ability to find compromise in almost any situation, an attribute sorely missing in the leadership of many of our leading institutions today. Baruch had this innate ability to look at all the options available and find solutions that were amenable to everyone. He would come into a meeting with intransigent opposing sides, and when he walked out, an approach had been found that all sides could live with. I really don't know how he did it, but it happened over and over again. He always saw the broader picture and found a way to get others to see it too. My family and I are so gratified that Holly Fernandez Lynch won this award in memory of Baruch. Not only has she made significant contributions to the field of medical ethics in research and scholarship on topics that Baruch was interested in, she gets what made him special. Their research overlapped, and Baruch even cited her books in his own arguments. Her book, I'm sorry. But most of all, and I quote her words, she understands how he valued both rigorous normative analysis and practical bioethics, how he saw the positive in people and their arguments and sought to be constructive rather than destructive in his commentary, and how he exhibited an unwavering commitment to his students and to mentoring junior faculty. Congratulations, Holly. Baruch would have been very honored and delighted that you are the first recipient of this very prestigious award in his memory. I am pleased to present Dr. Amy McGuire, Baruch's visionary successor as director of the center, who will introduce the honoree. Thank you.
Thank you, Dina. It's such an honor to have you and your entire family here all the way from Israel, and welcome to both Todd and Jeremy and Rocky. Baruch was a lot of things to me. He was a tremendous mentor. He took a huge risk on hiring me fresh out of grad school with really no track record and very little behind my name other than sort of ambition and maybe a naive optimism about the world of academia. But I was really, really fortunate to work under Baruch for the first 8 years of my career. He was also an inspiring teacher, as you mentioned, and it was really intimidating as a junior faculty member because there was one course in which I always had to give the lecture right after Baruch, and almost every single year that he gave that lecture, he'd get a standing ovation. And I'd have to go up after that and try to lecture as sort of a brand new assistant professor. It was extremely intimidating, but he was just infectious with the way in which he would teach. He would tell stories, he'd make people laugh, he would take his time, and he kind of got you to understand things in a way that you never thought you could understand them. He was also incredibly politically astute. In a medical center that's really plagued by competition and turf wars, he was able to get everybody on the same page. And I think that's one of the greatest things that we've accomplished here today in his memory, is getting three very large institutions that don't always play together in the same sandbox to play together in his honor. And I think he'd be very, very happy about that. But perhaps he was most well known for his intellectual acumen. And Baruch was really one of the clearest and most creative thinkers that I've ever known. And whether he was reviewing your paper or he was sitting in a committee meeting with you, he had a very specific MO, which is that he would sit very quietly and not say anything. And he'd let everybody else kind of run the rat race of arguing with each other and going around in circles about what the right answer is. And then just with enough time towards the end of the meeting, he'd pipe up with the most brilliant question that completely turned everybody's thinking on its head, and would leave everybody basically in silence, being like, of course that's what we should do, or of course that's how this argument should go. It was very frustrating when it was your paper that he was critiquing, because oftentimes it kind of undermined the entire thing that you had written, but it always made for a better work product and made your thinking more clear. Finally, Baruch was really a dear friend to me. I don't know his children very well, but I feel like I know them very well, even though I think this is the first time we've actually met in person. But he was always concerned and interested in everybody in the center, not just from the perspective of being a colleague or an employee, but really from a personal perspective. And for that, I'm incredibly grateful. So after Baruch's passing, it took us a while to kind of figure out what could we do in his honor that would be really worthy of this incredible man who we all honored so much. And so Charles, Tim, and I, and others from the philosophy department at Rice got together, and we were thinking about the best way to honor his legacy, and we started to outline what his main virtues are. And so we said, you know, what he was really known for in his career, what we all appreciated so much about him, was that he supported young faculty members. He took risks on young faculty members. He saw the potential in people even when they didn't see the potential in themselves. And he really valued, in the field of bioethics, the normative rigor with which he was trained. And so I think one of the things that he really was concerned about in our field was that we might eventually lose that analytic rigor that had really shaped the field in its early years. And so we wanted to do something in his honor to recognize those young scholars who are still contributing to that analytic and normative rigor in the field of bioethics. So we put out this award, and we didn't know what kinds of applicants we would get, but we were really, really thrilled to see that we got so many fantastic nominees from around the world who really had done tremendous work. And so it's particularly special to honor Holly, who rose to the top among a group of very, very talented junior individuals. It gave me a lot of hope and a lot of inspiration for sort of the field of bioethics as a whole, to just read the nominations and to talk to some of these junior scholars. So it's really a huge privilege and honor to introduce our honoree, Holly Fernandez Lynch. I will tell you that not only is she being awarded and giving the lecture today, but she will be publishing her paper from this lecture. She'll be submitting it for publication to AJOB, and assuming it is accepted, they'll be going out for peer commentary. So listen carefully. You might want to make points that you weren't able to make in the Q&A today. That should be over the summer. You can look for that if assuming all goes well. So I've known Holly's impressive scholarship over the years and have come to know her personally through her work as a Greenwall faculty scholar. For those of you who don't know, the Greenwall Foundation is a premier grant funding agency that supports bioethics research, and Baruch was really committed to the Greenwall Foundation as one of its founding program committee members. We're really fortunate to have the president of the Greenwall Foundation here today, Bernie Lowe. I don't know where Bernie is, but thank you for coming, Bernie. And I should also acknowledge that we had an outstanding selection committee that reviewed all of the nominations for this award, and I just want to thank them for their contributions to this. So Jenny Blumenthal-Barbie, everybody's in the room, Janet Malik, Peter Zook, Larry McCullough, Charles Milliken, and Elizabeth Brake. So we had several representatives from all three institutions, as well as some of them who were Baruch's own students and have gone on to very successful careers. So back to Holly. Holly Fernandez Lynch is the John Russell Dixon, M.D. Presidential Assistant Professor in Medical Ethics in the Department of Medical Ethics and Health Policy at the Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. Her current work focuses on clinical research ethics and regulation and the ethics of healthcare gatekeeping, with a focus on access to investigational therapies outside clinical trials. She is the author of Conflicts of Conscience in Healthcare and Institutional Compromise, as well as co-editor of 7 books on topics including human subjects research, FDA regulation on drugs, nudging health, religion and health law, big data, and transparency in healthcare. Holly was named a Greenwell Faculty Scholar in 2019. She served as a member of the United States Department of Health and Human Services Secretary's Advisory Committee on Human Research Protections from 2014 to 2019 and continues to serve on their subcommittee. She's joined the board of Public Responsibility in Medicine and Research, or PRIMER, the leading organization for IRB professionals, in 2020. She's also the founder and co-chair of the Consortium to Advance Effective Research Ethics Oversight, established in 2018. Prior to joining Penn, Holly was the executive director of the Petrie-Flom Center for Health Law Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics at Harvard Law School. She's worked as an attorney in private practice focused on pharmaceuticals regulation and as a bioethicist at NIH's Division of AIDS and at President Obama's Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues. Professor Fernandez Lynch attended college at Penn and was a Levy Scholar in Law and Bioethics at Penn Law and earned her master's in bioethics also from Penn. She's done a tremendous amount in her still blooming career. When I read this, it was hard to believe that she's our junior scholar and our rising star. She sounds like she's a pretty accomplished star. And one of the things that I really love about Holly is not only is she conceptually and analytically rigorous in Baruch's tradition, but she also has done work that's made a tremendous impact on policy, which Baruch cared a lot about. So please join me in welcoming Holly.
Thank you so much. I am just absolutely thrilled to be here today to celebrate Dr. Brody's life and legacy and to receive this award. I want to start just by thanking a number of people for this amazing honor. I can start by thanking the ethics leadership at Baylor College of Medicine, Center for Medical Ethics and Health Policy, Houston Methodist, and Rice University's Department of Philosophy for dreaming up this award and lecture as a way to recognize and encourage junior scholars. So as academics, we get exposed to a lot of rejection, okay? Our papers get rejected, our grant applications get rejected, our ideas get kind of torn apart, and we also get exposed to a lot of greatness, like Dr. Brody. And it becomes easy to wonder if we belong and if we will be good enough to make a durable contribution to the field. So opportunities like this are really a tremendous validation. I'm now 2.5 years into my first faculty appointment, and it's just really meaningful to be recognized for my work in bioethics at this stage. From what I've heard about him, Dr. Brody, as was mentioned, really exhibited an unwavering commitment to his students and to mentoring junior faculty, pushing them and encouraging them to be their absolute best. And I think this award is truly in that spirit. It's made me feel absolutely encouraged, welcomed as an academic bioethicist, and like much less of an imposter. So thank you very much. Next, I want to thank the selection committee for putting together a really rigorous and substantive selection process, lots of rounds to get to this stage in the game. And I want to thank Dr. Stephen Jaffe, who is my mentor and was the person who nominated me for this award. And then last but not least, I wanted to thank those of you who have really been gracious hosts and inviting me to Houston and making everything go off today without a hitch. So thank you to Lindsay Fuhrman and to Rebecca McBride. And of course, thank you to everyone in attendance tonight, and especially to Dr. Brody's family for being here today. I promise to give you some food for thought and hopefully to set a high bar for what will be an annual lecture. We've already heard a tremendous amount about Dr. Brody's greatness, but let me just say a few more words. Unfortunately, I never had the opportunity to meet Dr. Brody, but his presence is felt far and wide in bioethics. Like most in our field, I owe him a tremendous debt of gratitude. He really carried out foundational work to establish bioethics as a rigorous interdisciplinary area of study that's worthy of national commissions, academic departments, and the public's trust. He was an absolutely prolific scholar and tackled a range of issues of practical import to both patients and to policymakers. As an academic, Dr. Brody exhibited core qualities that I hope to emulate in my own career. As has been mentioned a number of times, right, he clearly valued rigorous normative analysis and practical bioethics, right, trying to figure out how to emphasize the importance of taking on real-world problems and developing feasible solutions to those problems. He freely offered his services on government committees and wasn't shy about engaging with bioethics policy. By all accounts, he saw the positive in people and their arguments, and he was open to arguments and ways to be convinced himself, right? Re-examining his views and being convinced potentially to change his mind. So I'm just remarkably grateful to be here honoring his legacy. And with thanks, I'm going to get on with the academic substance of my talk, which is what I think he would probably want. So what I'm going to focus on for the rest of this evening's lecture is how to grapple with the role of physicians as gatekeepers who have the power to stand between patients and the things that they want. Sometimes this comes up as a matter of personal or individual conflicts of conscience, but sometimes physicians are doing exactly what their profession was created to do, which is occasionally tell patients, no, you can't do that. No, you can't have that. And so the question is this: when is physician gatekeeping okay, and when isn't it? Or, you know, to put it in another way, when is physician gatekeeping a solution to a problem, and when is it a problem in and of itself? So just to get the juices flowing, imagine that you're an OBGYN who has a small private practice in Center City, Philadelphia. You love your job, caring for women. You have a great rapport with them. And at their first visit, you let your patients know that under no circumstances will you provide abortion care. You won't provide prescriptions for medication abortion. You won't provide referrals to other providers who are willing to perform those services because, in your view, abortions are morally wrong. You also state this clearly on your website. You're not hiding the ball at all. By a show of hands, how many in this room think that type of refusal is acceptable? Okay. I'm going to have my work cut out for me tonight. All right. Now, imagine you're not in Philadelphia. You're in Nebraska. And the next closest OBGYN practice is about an hour and a half away. Who amongst you thinks that a refusal in that context is ethically acceptable? Many fewer. Okay. Now imagine that you are a general practitioner and you are a strong opponent of medical aid in dying. It goes against your Catholic faith, but it also goes against the oath that you took, your Hippocratic oath, when you joined the profession of medicine. You actively lobbied against the law, ultimately unsuccessfully in your state, which has just legalized the practice. And you decide that if a patient comes to ask for a prescription to end their life, you will take advantage of the law's provision that allows physicians to refuse participation. Now, another show of hands, who thinks that type of refusal is acceptable? More, okay, more than in the first scenario. And now what if you know that your patient will find it burdensome to find another willing provider? Do you still think it's ethical to refuse in this context? Okay, great. Well, you know, there are lots and lots of other examples that we could ponder, but these are the types of things that we're talking about when we talk about conflicts of conscience in medicine. Typically, these things involve provider refusals to provide legally and clinically appropriate care that their patients want, but there's a lot of debate about what actually falls within the precise bounds of these categories. Most often, we see refusals come up in the context of reproductive care, and in fact, the first formal legal protections of physician conscience were a response to the Roe versus Wade decision. But conflicts of conscience are much broader than those that arise in the context of reproductive care. They also come up in the context of end-of-life care, as well as, for example, services that are requested by LGBT patients, including fertility treatments for same-sex couples or gender-affirming surgery for trans people. And as technology develops, for example, if we start to see interventions that were derived from embryonic stem cells, or we start to see an increase in genetic manipulation, for example, I think conflicts are likely to become more frequent and to affect a greater range of specialties. And this is really important because it means that the problems that are created by conflicts of conscience will become more and more difficult to avoid. So what is the problem specifically, right? It's either that the doctor is forced to provide an objectionable service or face some penalty, which causes that individual to suffer a harm, or it's that their patient may suffer a harm due to the physician's refusal. And this sets up a situation in which the problem is cast as imposing or trumping rights. Either the doctor wins and imposes their view on the patient, or the patient wins and imposes their view on the doctor. Now, some people argue that these are not concerns on an equal playing field, that the doctor's moral harm cannot compete with the patient's risk for physical harm, or that the doctor made a choice, right, to join the profession that the patient didn't. And we'll talk about these challenges in a little bit, but for now, I just want to note two things. First, this may language that I've underlined with regard to the patient can help, because I think it offers some room for compromise. It might be possible for a doctor to refuse to perform certain services while preventing harm for the patient if somebody else can step in to provide the requested service. And second, I think it's important to keep in mind that in an ideal world, we can balance both conscience and access. This winner-take-all, one-sided approach is not the best path forward. Instead, I think we should try to balance both sets of interests whenever we can. The problem is that the status quo is actually very one-sided. It emphasizes protections for physicians with very little attention to patient access. Now, before we get into even going through the specific legal protections of conscience, it's important to realize that there are several less formal protections that physicians can take advantage of. They can pick a specialty where they're able to avoid conflicts. And this is part of the reason that we might see refusals come up with more frequency for professionals like pharmacists or hospital staff or other people who are more generalist in what they're being asked to do. Physicians can avoid training in objectionable services, right? You only have an obligation to provide services that you're capable of providing, and so you can kind of avoid conflict by not gaining that expertise. You can decide not to initiate doctor-patient relationships with patients who you think are likely to request services that you find objectionable. There are some parameters around that with regard to public accommodations law. For example, you can't be discriminatory in who you take on as a patient. And then they can also avoid employment relationships that might expose them to concerning circumstances. And all of these things work because, at least in this country, patients have virtually no legal rights to health care, and certainly they don't have the right to demand care from any specific physician that they haven't already embarked in a doctor-patient relationship with. Now, beyond those informal protections, there are a whole host of formal legal protections over physician conscience that also sometimes apply to institutional conscience or other professionals. And these are present at both the federal and the state level, and they're becoming increasingly prevalent over time. So, for example, the Trump administration has taken efforts to expand conscience protections recently, interpreting existing laws to cover more providers, more services, more activities, and to ramp up enforcement activities. Right now, the regulations are under a nationwide injunction, But in general, these conscience laws protect against consequences that might otherwise befall a refusing physician. For example, civil liability, financial harm, loss of training opportunities or employment opportunities, or even loss of licensure. But there's a wide variety of coverage of these laws. There's also pretty substantial variation in the services that are covered. Some conscience clauses are specific to things like abortion or sterilization. Other conscience clauses cover refusal to provide any lawful health service. Some laws are bidirectional in their protection, meaning that they protect both refusers of services and people who are willing to provide controversial services. But for the most part, the laws focus on protecting refusers. There's also a wide variation in the behaviors and the entities that are covered. And I think this is really important to point out, variability in the exceptions that are incorporated into these laws. So sometimes there is an exception for emergency services, but that is not universal. There is way more detail that we could go into with regard to the legal side of conscience protection and conscientious objection. But the key takeaway that I want to present you with here is that physician refusers have a lot of protection that's available to them, but there's been almost no attention legally to the impact on patients. And I hope this goes without saying, but this one-sidedness is really problematic. Now, we could go all the way to the opposite extreme and say, look, we're just not going to protect physician refusals anymore. And this would be allowable by law in at least some circumstances. So I think sometimes people think, oh no, the First Amendment requires that we have these types of conscience protections on the books. This is actually not the case. So imagine that there was a licensure requirement that you have to be willing to provide abortion services if you want to be a licensed physician. This would satisfy the First Amendment's requirements. It would be a neutral law of general applicability. Neutral meaning that it's not intended to burden religion, and it would be generally applicable to anybody who is interested in becoming a physician. There are also Religious Freedom Restoration Acts, both at the federal level and at state levels, that have even a higher standard of scrutiny, that I suspect a law that required physicians to perform certain services could satisfy if it became really clear that that was the only way to protect patient access. But I think this moving to the opposite extreme is not the right approach either. Why do I think it's a bad idea? Well, I can explain it by responding to some arguments in favor of dramatically curtailing the types of protections that are currently available to physicians. Sometimes these arguments are based on the idea that refusing physicians, they must be violating their ethical and professional duties. And I don't think that that's necessarily the case. So the first argument is fairly straightforward. I alluded to it before, right? Some point out that the physician is the one who decided to put themselves in the circumstance in which a conflict could arise in the first instance. But it's important to acknowledge that when people decide to become physicians and stay in the profession, they're doing it against this pretty expansive backdrop of conscience protections that I just described here. So it's not clear that they're breaking any promise, right? Society has offered them these protections, and that's part of the contract, the sort of social contract that they are entering into. So it may be the case that we could change things going forward, but for people who are already in the profession, this is kind of the bargain that's been struck. The second argument is that it's the physician's job to do what the patient wants. This puts, patients in the driver's seat, and in general, patients ought to be in control of their care. But it's not the case that we really expect physicians to just do whatever it is that patients want. They are supposed to exercise ethical and professional discretion. Now, these are, of course, value judgments, but it might be that the profession has taken a particular stance that's wrong. Right? It's not crazy to think that we really do want physicians who are in the position to be able to push back against orders or duties that they find morally troublesome, whether those are being put on them by other members of the profession or by patients. Another argument is that when physicians' interests in their own moral integrity conflicts with patient interests in accessing desired services, that it's the patient's interests that have the greater moral weight. And I actually think that's true, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the physician's interests are irrelevant. And if we can find ways to accommodate both sets of interests rather than allowing the conflict to persist, we ought to do so. Similarly, it's true that physicians have a responsibility not to impose their own value judgments on their patients by refusing to provide certain services. But again, it's possible to avoid that imposition when there are other willing physicians available to the patient. So I think if we pull all of these arguments together, they suggest that physicians are not necessarily violating their professional duties and that there's a reason to try to find ways to accommodate them. It turns out Dr. Brody and his colleague Doug White agreed with this position. They published this JAMA commentary in 2011, identifying some practical and ethical reasons why we might not want to force conscientious refusers out of the profession. Now, they start out by suggesting that accepting refusals might increase confidence in the profession. For example, by convincing patients that doctors do really care about what's right, they won't just do anything for a buck. Whether this is true, I think, is an empirical question, and I could easily hypothesize in the other direction that maybe patient confidence would be shaken by the perception that physicians will put their interests ahead of those of their patients. But they offered some other reasons to protect conscientious refusers that I think are more convincing. So, for example, they argue that, look, physicians are autonomous agents too, and we need to be very careful to select morally serious individuals as people to join the profession. They were ahead of their time talking about concerns about physician burnout and this idea that if we expect physicians to do things that they don't find morally acceptable, that's going to be really problematic for their ability to provide high quality care and their willingness to stay part of the profession. And they also talk about the fact that the norms of medicine change over time. So it might be asking too much of physicians to say, okay, I've joined the profession, and whatever the profession decides for as long as I'm a member, I'm just going to, go along with and stay in stride, constantly willing to subvert my own views to that of the profession. So I happen to agree with most of these points. I do think they give us substantial pause for approaches that would just kick refusers out of the profession. And I would add just a couple of additional reasons, right? So first, how do we know that the profession's current moral stance is the right one, right? These are areas of disagreement often. They're not scientific facts. And so, having some dissenters within the ranks of the profession can help push to justify views and incorporate changes where appropriate. Incorporating diverse perspectives within the profession also has some benefit for patients. It allows them the capacity to find physicians who might be aligned with their own views, and that can help improve trust in the doctor-patient relationship. And then the one that I find probably the most convincing is just this practical argument that when we fail to protect physician conscience, we risk throwing the baby out with the bathwater, right? These professionals might be otherwise excellent, other than refusing to provide a limited set of services. So an alternative framing would be to treat them as subspecialists who don't provide all of the services within their field, but there are lots of physicians who subspecialize and provide excellent services in those that they do offer. So again, I think this pushes us to focus on finding room for compromise, but making sure that there are limits around conscience protection so that it can be used as a shield for the physician, but not a sword to impose their views on others. So what might a reasonable compromise look like in this space? The key is to make sure that physician refusals are not effectively blocking patient access to desired services. And we can achieve that goal by recognizing that a single physician's refusal won't often have that effect. Ultimately, it's the profession as a whole that has obligations, and those obligations don't always trickle down to individual professionals. Now, more specifically, it's important to acknowledge that physicians have been granted a monopoly over the provision of certain services in recognition of their special expertise and also in part due to their political clout and ability to keep other professionals out. As a result of this monopoly, it's the profession as a whole that has an obligation to make the services that are uniquely assigned to its gatekeeping authority appropriately available. But each individual physician might not bear that monopoly when there are other physicians who are available to provide the requested service. And that allows us to bifurcate our understanding of the obligations of the medical profession versus its constituent professionals. Specifically, individual physicians are not usually the only ones who could open the gate for a patient. And when they refuse to do so in those cases where there are other gatekeepers available, I think they haven't breached any professional obligation because they aren't the ones that bear the professional monopoly. Now, this bifurcation offers a way to solve, I think, the conflicts of conscience problem. If we can avoid individual professionals bearing the profession's monopoly all on their own, then we are in a position to protect both conscience and patient access. In other words, we need to reduce the gatekeeping authority of any individual doctor by making sure that there are enough other willing doctors that nobody has to stand in as the last doctor in town. So it's a little counterintuitive, but the goal, I think, is to reduce gatekeeping obligations by adding more willing gatekeepers and then getting them to the places where patients are in need of care. Now, if we view the conflicts in this way, it's really a matter of supply and demand. We need to calibrate the supply of physicians who are willing to provide various services, often controversial services. We need to calibrate the number of those physicians who are available to meet patient demand for those services. And since this is an obligation that's rooted in the profession's monopoly, then achieving this calibration, I think, appropriately falls to state licensing boards, which are in the position of granting and enforcing that monopoly privilege by keeping other providers out. So the first step is to figure out which patient demands the profession as a whole has an obligation to meet. And there are some limits on this. Of course, the profession has no obligation and cannot provide access to illegal services, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they have to provide access to every service that is legal. There's an expectation that the profession is going to exercise judgment about what services are appropriate for patients. So first and foremost, that means that they only have to meet demands for clinically appropriate care. This isn't necessarily restricted only to medically necessary care. It can also cover elective services that also fall within the profession's monopoly. It also means that the profession only has the responsibility to provide ethically appropriate care. Sometimes the judgment about what's ethically appropriate will be captured within legal prohibitions, but that's not always the case. It's not exclusively up to the medical profession to determine what's ethically appropriate, right? These are value judgments, not only in the exclusive province of the medical profession, but I do think it's reasonable to suspect that there's no obligation to, for example, meet the demands of wannabe octomoms who want to have 8 babies at a time, or, it might allow us to be a bit more restrictive about meeting demand for ethically challenging services, such as selective abortion. Now, once the demands are clear, then the next step is to figure out how to generate an adequate supply of willing physicians. And that means we need to figure out what kind of patient burden, inconvenience, or delay is reasonable. And in doing so, it's appropriate to acknowledge that for specialty services or services that are going to be provided in rural areas, that access is going to inevitably be lower. That's true even if we take conscience out of the equation altogether. We also need to figure out how many willing physicians we have and how many more physicians we need to meet patient demand. So refusers could be expected to register their refusals, right? This is what we see in the context of the military. And then in order to increase the supply to meet any gap, then we can train more willing physicians and give them incentives to practice in certain specialties and geographic areas. It's important to expand the number of slots for physicians so that the refusers are not taking up slots that could be filled by willing providers. We do some of this supply and demand calculation now with things like the number of residency slots that we open up in different medical specialties, or providing loan forgiveness programs for physicians to go practice in rural areas. So that's kind of what I have in mind in this context too. Now, when we're counting up the supply of willing physicians and registering refusers, it's not the case that we have to accept any and all refusals that a physician might offer. And we can differentiate between acceptable and unacceptable refusals by focusing on the potential for patient harm. So in my view, a patient is not harmed simply by knowing that somebody disagrees with their requested care, as long as they're able to reasonably access that care in another way. But they are harmed by being discriminated against, regardless if there's another willing physician who's in the office right next door. So the dividing line that I've drawn is that physician refusal is appropriately respected when it applies to a particular service that a physician would refuse regardless of who is asking for it, right? I don't provide IVF services to anybody. I don't perform abortions for anybody. But these refusals should not be respected when they apply only to certain individuals on grounds that would be invidiously discriminatory, meaning that they are based on personal characteristics that are medically irrelevant to the patient's care. And the idea here, I think, is pretty simple, that separate but equal care is unacceptable in these contexts. Now remember that the goal here was to match the supply of willing physicians to patient demand for services under the profession's monopoly so that individual refusers can avoid bearing the profession's gatekeeping obligations all on their own. But sometimes these things aren't going to work out. So when a patient cannot reasonably secure a service from a willing provider, any willing provider, then the refuser does have a moral obligation to provide it. And that means that physician conscience ought not be protected in cases of true emergencies. In these situations, it's really a matter of the patient's interests versus the physician's interests, and I think here the physician's interests must yield. The same reasoning, I think, applies when a physician finds themselves as the last doctor in town in non-emergency cases. But the question of whether we ought to enforce that obligation, I think, is a bit trickier in these scenarios as a practical matter. And that's because if the refusing physician decides to just quit, right, forget it, I'm not going to provide the service and I'm just going to leave the profession altogether, rather than provide the requested care, nobody is better off. The patient who requested the care is still not going to get the service. And then the patients who are benefiting from that physician's existence, right, in that geographic area are also not going to be able to benefit from their services. So although I think there is an ethical obligation to provide services in these cases, it might be an area that's tricky to enforce. And really the best approach is to work as hard as possible to avoid these circumstances from coming to the fore. Now, in addition to limits on discriminatory refusals or emergency scenarios, I think there are a few other non-negotiable obligations that apply to every member of the profession individually. One that often gets discussed is whether the refusing physician has an obligation to refer patients to willing providers. I'm not so sure that they do. I think it really depends on how easily the patient could find an alternative provider. But refusers absolutely have a responsibility to notify patients about care that they're unwilling to provide so that those patients can come up with alternative arrangements before the need becomes urgent. And refusers also need to make sure that they aren't refusing based on inaccurate information. So if I am a physician that has a moral objection to abortion, and then I'm concerned about prescribing certain oral contraceptives because I think they're the equivalent of abortifacients, then I have a responsibility to really understand how these different drugs work in the body. And then last but certainly not least, physicians have an obligation never to withhold information from patients about clinically appropriate treatment options. So pulling this all together, I think if we view physicians as gatekeepers, it can help offer a compromise solution to the conflict of conscience problem, because it allows a focus on making sure there's someone available to open the gate to patients who are asking for various services. Rather than assuming this is always the responsibility of individual physicians, we can recognize that access obligations are collectively held by the whole profession, and that helps us facilitate both conscience and access. And in case you're interested in digging to these issues anymore, this is the book that I've written that works these theories out in much more detail. Now, there's another approach, though, to some of the problems that are posed by physician gatekeeping, and that's to reduce their gatekeeping authority altogether rather than adding more physician gatekeepers to help promote patient access. So what if we protected conscience and access by taking physicians out of the equation altogether or reducing their authority in circumstances where conflicts of conscience are likely to arise? So one way to do this would be to expand the professional monopoly to other providers beyond physicians, right? We might tap nurse practitioners or pharmacists, for example, acknowledging that they're also independent professionals who may exert their own claims to conscience. But a good recent example of this is a law that was recently passed in California focused on HIV prevention. So this law will go into effect in July of this year, and it allows pharmacists to dispense HIV prevention medications, PrEP and PEP, without a doctor's prescription. So pharmacists with special training will be eligible to provide patients with a 60-day supply of these medicines. And then after that, a prescription will be required. But the idea is to get patients over this initial period. Maybe they've got a new partner and they're unable to get into the doctor's office soon enough to get a prescription. They have to show the pharmacist proof that they have had a negative HIV test in the past 7 days, which is intended to address concerns around drug resistance. We might also think about this type of solution, this pharmacy-based non-prescription solution for things like controversial vaccines, like the HPV vaccine, for example, or for other things like naloxone for opioid overdose, which is available behind the counter through a pharmacist in at least some states. Now, going a bit further, another way to reduce physician gatekeeping would be not to incorporate other professionals, but to eliminate any gatekeepers at all. And here the example that I have in mind is Plan B, emergency contraception, which was approved by FDA in the 1990s. And then it was approved for a switch to over-the-counter status for patients who are 18 and older in 2006. That age range was dropped to 17 in 2009, and in 2013, all age restrictions were removed. So you can go into any pharmacy and find Plan B on the shelf without any physician gatekeeper or any other gatekeeper other than the ability to pay the out-of-pocket cost, which is about $50 a dose. This approach has also been considered for access to monthly oral contraceptives and as well as access to pharmaceutical abortion. All of these examples that I've just presented are for drugs that have been at the center of conscience refusals, but these solutions aren't going to be applicable for every type of conflicts of conscientious objection or conflict. And the reason is sometimes we really do need physicians as gatekeepers because they've got special technical expertise and it's not something that the patient can kind of do on their own or self-administer. But I do think that where we can rely on this type of solution is in the pharmaceutical context. But it raises much bigger questions about whether and when we need physician gatekeepers at all, right? It's not only that it's the circumstance of conflicts of conscience where we have this tension between physicians and patients. Right, so the main challenge that conflicts of conscience lay bare is this tension that patients are being asked to rely on physicians or other gatekeepers for things that they want or need. And that can be problematic in a wide variety of circumstances. It could be that the patient wants something that the physician thinks is just a bad idea for the patient, right? They want opioids for pain medication. They want ADHD medicines without a formal diagnosis. They want psychiatric drugs without a plan for clear follow-up care. It might be the case that the patient just has difficulty getting to a doctor to secure permission for something that the doctor would be willing to say yes to, right? They have to take time off from work. They have to maybe get childcare. They have to shell out the copays. And it might also just be the case that competent adult patients will bristle at the idea of having to go to another person and say, please, may I have access to this medicine that I would like to use for myself? So again, this bigger question is whether and when physician gatekeeping is justified at all, particularly given some social trends that are becoming more prevalent. The democratization of information through the internet, rejection of medical paternalism, and really more broad-scale rejection of expertise across the board. Now, if we look at a specific case study of prescription versus over-the-counter drugs, we can more closely examine these questions about when physician gatekeeping might be justified. And this is a project that I'm working on now with two colleagues from Penn, Madison Kilbride and Stephen Jaffe. At present, a number of drugs are available over the counter. And that designation really is most protective of patient autonomy. You decide that you want to try something, you walk into the store, pick it up, nobody's asking any questions. But other drugs, of course, require sign-off by a prescription gatekeeper. So how should we figure out which drugs belong in which category? And when we think prescriptions are required, how can we legitimately justify that intrusion on patient autonomy? To answer these questions, we can start with the law. I am a lawyer, after all. So this is the FDA statute that's talking about how do you fall into the prescription drug category. So if a drug, because of its toxicity or other potentiality for harmful effect, or the method of its use, or collateral measures necessary to its use, is not safe except for use under the supervision of a practitioner licensed by law, then the drug can only be dispensed with a prescription and it gets exempted from consumer labeling requirements. This is all about emphasizing patient protection, right? You get prescription status when you need somebody to help the patient. You get over-the-counter status when it feels like the patient can do this on their own. And you can see there's a pretty substantial difference between prescription and consumer labeling, right? We have the prescription labeling over here on the right and the consumer labeling on the left. And it really reflects the difference in the information that's deemed essential for safe use of the product, right? A lot more information being given to the physician so that they can appropriately prescribe products. Now, as for products that are deemed safe for over-the-counter use, they have to be able to be used safely by laypersons, which FDA goes on to define as ordinary people, including those of low comprehension. Now, almost all new drugs are approved first as prescription status, but it's possible for a prescription drug to switch to over-the-counter if FDA determines that prescription status is no longer necessary for the protection of public health. And this almost always requires a company to proactively submit another application to FDA seeking permission for an over-the-counter switch. FDA is not generating these switches typically on their own. The specific standards for how a drug can be placed in the over-the-counter category are actually surprisingly not listed out in any particular regulation, but if you kind of pull together the requirements of a number of different regulations, this is the list that is generated. So sponsors have to demonstrate that the benefits of the product outweigh its risks, that there's a low potential for misuse and abuse when patients are using these products on their own without a prescription gatekeeper. The patient needs to be able to self-diagnose and self-administer the product. They need to be able to understand enough about the labeling to make these decisions appropriately without a physician overseeing the use. And the takeaway from all of this legal and regulatory background is that at present, FDA is applying a prescription default. It assumes that new drugs are not appropriate for over-the-counter status without prescription gatekeeping unless the sponsor can prove otherwise. But this prescription status is interfering with patient autonomy, right? So it shouldn't necessarily be the default. Instead, we should start with the assumption that products will be made available over the counter unless there's a good reason to switch them to prescription status. And often there will be a good reason. One justification for prescription gatekeeping and the associated interference with patient autonomy is that over-the-counter use of a product may threaten harm to third parties. So this could most obviously happen if a drug is misused by patients in a way that's a threat to community welfare. For example, if antibiotics are made available over the counter, we might worry that patients would use them inappropriately, leading to drug-resistant infections that could impact other patients. Third-party harms are also a concern, even if patients are using a product perfectly appropriately, right? You might have a drug that causes extreme drowsiness such that a patient shouldn't be driving. And in that case, prescription gatekeeping can help make sure that the patient really understands the precautions that they need to undertake. It's not necessarily going to, have the physician sitting in the passenger seat next to the driver, making sure that they're using these precautions, but it allows the warnings to be made in a more direct way than over-the-counter status would. Similarly, in the context of drugs that are susceptible to diversion, a prescription gatekeeper can help monitor use and refills to make sure that there isn't kind of a flood, of the product available to people outside of prescription status. So I don't mean to suggest that prescription status is going to be a panacea for these third-party harms, but I do think it can help mitigate some of the foreseeable consequences. And this is not paternalist, right? This is protecting, the rest of the population. But, there are a number of harms that we might be worried about that are truly self-regarding harms. We might worry that patients will overdose on non-prescription medicines, or that they'll improperly administer them, or that they could have interactions with other drugs that they might be taking. And so prescription status can minimize these harms to self, but it might not always be necessary or desired by the patients who are intended to be protected. Some patients might be perfectly capable of protecting themselves, right? You could have nurses, for example, who are perfectly capable of understanding, complex medical information, but are unable to write themselves a prescription. And other patients might simply prefer to exercise their own autonomy. So when would prescription gatekeeping be justified in these contexts? I don't think it's justified to interfere with patient decisions about whether to take a drug just because we're worried that they might harm themselves with their own autonomous decisions, right? This would exemplify hard paternalism that I think is fairly difficult to justify. But we might be justified in making sure that these decisions are at least informed and voluntary, and therefore truly autonomous and worthy of respect. And so this would fall under the realm of soft paternalism. On this rationale, prescription gatekeeping could just serve kind of as a check regarding whether the patient knew what they're getting themselves into by taking a particular drug. But once their autonomy was confirmed, then we'd have little reason to interfere with their autonomous choice. And importantly, if we adopted this approach, it would create a much different role for the physician, which would basically just be standing in the role of confirming the patient's autonomy. Once that was confirmed, then just writing the prescription for whatever it is the patient wants, right? That's quite different from what we expect physicians to do today. It's also true that many patients are not really in the position to make these expert judgments for themselves, to be able to manipulate all of the complex information and data about risks and benefits of the various products that might be appropriate for their diseases and conditions in order to make autonomous judgments without support. And it's also not clear that doctors are in a good position to be able to differentiate those patients who are able to make voluntary informed choices from those who are maybe suffering from a mistake or a misunderstanding. At the very least, I think it would be quite resource intensive to ask physicians to differentiate patients in this way, and it would extend pretty substantially beyond the type of informed consent that happens when a doctor writes a prescription. So I think these circumstances point to a scenario in which group soft paternalism is justified. And what I mean by that is that you're interfering with the autonomy of some individuals in order to protect the autonomy of other individuals, especially in the context of a government regulatory decision that has to apply to an entire group without the potential for individualization, right? FDA has to make this judgment about whether the product is prescription or over-the-counter for the entire population. So when a substantial portion of patients would struggle to use a drug safely without guidance, and it's hard to separate those patients out from those who would be able to make these autonomous judgments, I think prescription gatekeeping is justifiable, right? The prescription status in this scenario is protecting patients from making decisions that are not truly informed and voluntary because they face a high risk of misunderstanding or mistake. And we could imagine that this is most likely the case for drugs to treat diseases that are hard to self-diagnose, that have complicated dosing schedules, that require careful management of drug-drug interactions, and that require monitoring of the patient via complicated tests. But, right, I acknowledge that this group soft paternalism is a type of paternalism, and it sacrifices the autonomy of some patients. And so it's important to minimize those sacrifices. And we can do that in a couple of ways. First, we can, instead of assuming that patients are unable to make these decisions on their own, there are a number of studies that are available, study designs that are available to help understand whether patients can make these decisions. And they're precisely the type of studies that we expect sponsors to do when they're appealing to FDA to have their prescription product switched to over-the-counter status. So these might involve labeling comprehension studies, studies to figure out whether patients are capable of self-selecting a drug that would be appropriate for their condition. And then the other thing we might be able to do is find new ways to support safe use of pharmaceuticals short of requiring a physician's prescription. And this is something that FDA has expressed some interest in through this program that you see listed on the screen here, the Non-Prescription Drug Safe Use and Regulatory Expansion Initiative, which has the acronym of ENSURE. And what FDA has proposed in this context is greater attention to use of things like pharmacy counseling or aids for self-diagnosis apps or things that you might be able to use on your phone. And they've also considered buttressing consumer labeling through things like interactive displays and kiosks at a pharmacy, apps that would allow information to be both provided and would allow patients to have their comprehension of that information tested. So the idea is, can we use technological approaches to make more products available over the counter? Now, so far, I've justified prescription gatekeeping for the protection of third parties and also for patients who might not be in the position of protecting themselves from decisions that are not truly informed and voluntary. But there might be another argument that physician gatekeeping of pharmaceuticals is helpful to help clarify to insurers whether they ought to be willing to pay for a patient to use a particular product because it's reasonable and necessary. And this is an important function of prescription status today, but prescription status is not necessary to achieve that outcome. It could be the case that patients are able to use a product over the counter and then submit for reimbursement to their insurance company with a physician's authorization, right? The physician could still say, yes, I agree that the patient needs this product without having to stand in the way as a gatekeeper. It would require insurers to be willing to cover over-the-counter drugs, but some do already in some limited scenarios. So some insurers cover over-the-counter contraceptives, aspirin to prevent cardiovascular disease, smoking cessation aids, and things like folic acid supplements for pregnant women. So the key here is to make sure that we aren't engaging in this kind of unintended consequence of having patients be more autonomous and able to buy things over the counter, but then it hits them in their pocketbook because their insurers are unwilling to cover over-the-counter medicines. Now, in terms of policy implications, I think what the implication is that FDA should assume that new drugs will be made available over the counter unless they have a good reason to interfere with patient autonomy by requiring prescription status. And it may be that those good reasons are often present, and so we might say, well, does changing the default really matter? I do think it's more respectful of patient autonomy, for one, and it's good to be very explicit about these reasons. And the nice thing about defaults is that when there are products that are on the cusp, instead of falling into the prescription category, they would fall into the over-the-counter category. So which products might this proposal make the biggest difference for? You know, I think first and most obvious are products that are broadly viewed as safe for use, but nonetheless have been restricted to prescription status, like oral contraceptives, for example. There's really no good evidence-based reason for infringing on patient autonomy in this context. Really, the prescription status of these drugs reflects politics. And so this would be, I think, an obvious candidate to move over the counter. Second might be products that are all used almost exclusively by expert patients, those who have been diagnosed with a chronic condition. And so there's an opportunity for physicians to relay information to those patients without necessarily requiring prescription gatekeeping. So in this category, we might think about things like epinephrine auto-injectors for allergies or analog insulin for diabetics. And one important thing about this category is that these drugs are very unlikely to be attractive to anybody except for those who really need them. Third are products that would be available for conditions that affect vulnerable populations who might have difficulty securing prescriptions. Here we might be more worried about the risks of these patients going untreated than we would worry about the side effects of whatever the medications that might be available to them. So this might include drugs for smoking cessation, and as in the example earlier, drugs for HIV prevention. So in general, I think it's worth considering over-the-counter status for products that have wide therapeutic margins, right, that it's difficult for patients to misuse, that don't need complicated clinical testing, for easily diagnosed conditions, and those that are able to be self-administered. So let me just wrap up by bringing, what might seem like two disparate pieces of the talk about conscience and prescription access, unifying these two different pieces of the talk by focusing on physician gatekeeping. So physicians, of course, have substantial authority over their patients, both as a legal matter and as an interpersonal one. Sometimes that authority has good justification, right? So for example, when physicians have clinical expertise or prowess that patients lack, and when patients would struggle to make medical judgments on their own. But I think sometimes physician gatekeeping can go too far. And this happens when patients are unable to access clinically appropriate services due to the physician's personal beliefs, or when regulators are bestowing decision-making authority on physicians when patients are really capable of making their own autonomous judgments. So I think in these cases, we really do need to recalibrate authority by reducing physician gatekeeping, either to make it less concentrated in individual physicians or by reducing physician gatekeeping altogether. And with that, I will close, and we have some time for questions. I'm told that there are mics on the sides, but if not, I will repeat questions so that those on the web can hear. Yes?
What is your thinking on a question where you just separate the people in your argument about conscious suggestion? The idea has to do with the linkage between access to care and social vulnerability. Just to give you a context for that, in Vermont, where we have no abortion, but we do not perform abortion in all circumstances. Our hospital does not perform the abortion. Wrestle with this, particularly in times when not wealthy enough to go someplace else to get the service. Wrestle with whether the our obligation to provide the service. That is
Yeah, great. So just to repeat the question in shorter form. So the question is about an institutional refusal to perform abortion services that would disparately affect different patients within the community, because some patients could go out of state to secure the service, whereas other patients won't have the resources to do that. And can I just get a little bit more clarification? Is the reason that the institution is unwilling to do a conscience-based reason?
I want to get to the lead. We have an institutional process to try to solve often diverse
Yeah. Okay, so I think this is a good example where it becomes important to figure out what does it mean to have a service be reasonably available to the patient versus what does it mean for an institution to be the last institution in town. So I focused on physician-based conscience, and then there's a whole host of other issues related to institutional-based conscience, whether institutions themselves can have a conscience versus, you know, the individual professionals that make up that institution. In the example that you've provided, it seems fairly clear to me that patients will have their ability to access a legal service and, you know, clinically appropriate service, it sounds like in at least some circumstances, made unavailable to them by virtue of this decision, which has some conscience-based elements to it, it sounds like. Now, whether the institution itself has a responsibility to make the service available, I think is a bit different from whether the individual physicians have a responsibility to make the service available, right? I've been talking about physician gatekeepers and the professional monopoly. To translate that to this institutional scenario, you guys are finding yourself in a monopoly circumstance. These patients cannot get the service anywhere else, in part because of the benefits that your institution is reaping by virtue of the physicians who are practicing there. Other people are not allowed to provide that service. So that suggests to me that there is a responsibility to provide that service because of the difficulty of access. I don't think that you could say, oh, we're only going to provide it to these patients who have proven that they don't have the means to travel out of state. There are all sorts of burdens that are not just financial burdens, right? Whether patients ought to have to travel, you know, 2 or 3 hours out of state to find somewhere else is an important part of the consideration. Oh, yes.
Pediatrician X is the only game, and she makes a decision to not see children whose parents.
Yes, yeah, I thought about this. So this, I think, sorry, to repeat the question, what to do about a pediatrician who is really, you know, the only game in town and who's refusing to provide services to families who refuse to vaccinate their children. I think this highlights the question about what's a conscience-based refusal versus what's a professional-based refusal, right? Meaning that you think this is the professionally appropriate care, and so the reason that you are advocating the patients receive it is not to impose your own personal moral beliefs, but to encourage patients to get clinically appropriate care. And there might also be an argument about protecting other patients within your practice, right? That you don't want unvaccinated patients to be milling around the waiting room, potentially infecting others. So I'm not totally convinced that these are always examples of conscientious objection as opposed to professional objection. Practically speaking, I think these are difficult refusals to justify because they don't always achieve their goals of actually getting patients to proceed through vaccination. And I think empirically the evidence suggests that the way to change families' minds about this is through kind of gentle education rather than, you know, excluding patients in a way that might kind of feed into myths about the medical profession being unwilling to hear different views. Yes. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk. I really appreciate your attention to balancing the interests of refusers and, you know, patients seeking care. So your idea of adding gatekeepers. My question is, I'm interested to hear your thoughts about, you know, how you encourage state medical boards or state legislatures in states where that conflict of interest may be more acutely felt. So a state which may be more rural, perhaps more conservative, more protecting of religious liberty and conscientious refusal.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, certainly there are different political stripes across the country, and you know, we see that reflected in the state conscience legislation, how protective it is versus whether there are protections in place for patient access. And my argument is kind of, it's irrespective of political persuasion, that if you are granting a monopoly over these services to a profession, then you also have to make it true that the profession is able to deliver on those monopoly services. So yes, definitely politically challenging. I mean, I wrote this book with this proposal several years ago and no one's picking it up yet. You know, fully admit that it's easier said than done to get state licensing boards to pay attention to this level of access. And it's not easy, right? It requires a pretty substantial change in what we're asking these licensing boards to do, to have physicians register their refusal and to do this kind of counting up and making it, and the difficult work about figuring out how much access is sufficient to count as access, and what burdens are we appropriately placing on patients to receive services. So yes, politically challenging, more so in some parts of the country than others.
Thank you.
Oh, yes. Sorry, the mic is kind of tucked behind the wall there.
I want to extend the Vermont question you had just a moment ago, because you asked whether it was a conscience-based refusal or not. I'm a pediatrician who has worked in 18 states. Half of that has been in rural areas where I might be the only pediatrician. And what I find in these small hospitals is there's a whole bunch of things they can and cannot do that are based on a whole bunch of other criteria, and it ends up making my decision of whether I have to send the child 200 miles, 300 miles to a major children's hospital or not. So I want to ask, why is it that we can look at a conscience refusal and say, well, that may be a problem because that's religious-based, but when these physicians make all sorts of other decisions to refuse to do something, a surgeon will do certain operations, not others, that's considered acceptable. Is this a hostility towards religion?
No, I mean, I'm arguing exactly the opposite, right? I'm arguing that we ought to treat physician refusers as subspecialists, the way we treat other physicians who decide I'm only willing to take this type of patient or I'm only willing to provide this type of service. Now, the way that we might criticize a physician refuser for burdening patients when they don't have alternative access to care, we could apply those same criticisms to the physician who overly specializes in a geographic area that actually would need them to provide a wider range of services.
And from an institutional standpoint?
Yeah, sorry, I should have repeated the question about, an institutional standpoint in terms of what they can make their practitioners do. Is that what you mean? Yeah, where I thought you were going to go with this question is what to do when an institution blocks physicians from doing things that they think is morally appropriate. There's some litigation going on right now where a physician outside of her practice within the hospital was helping to facilitate a patient who had requested medical aid in dying. And then the hospital fired the physician saying, you violated the terms of your employment agreement with us. We think this type of care is inappropriate and you're not allowed to provide it even on your own time. And so that's a circumstance where I think these laws that are bidirectional in protecting physician conscience to provide a service, right? There are physicians who feel a moral calling to help patients who are experiencing intractable suffering to take advantage of these laws. And so then it becomes a tension between the physician, the practitioner's conscience, and the institution's conscience. I tend to think that particular litigation is pretty easy to suss out because the law has built-in protections for practitioners who are willing to provide the service. So it really was an illegal employment action against this physician. But it's a really, really challenging question of what to do when there's conflicts between what the institution wants and what the practitioner wants to do.
Thank you.
Yes.
It seems that a lot of times when you have subspecialties, and a patient shows up at the doctor's door, then there's a great incentive for that physician to go ahead and perform whatever service it is that they've defined or practiced on such a narrow area. There's financial incentives and plus the sort of the mindset. The area that you described where all these subspecialties are created for these various services, does it not create then a scenario where they're incented, so to speak, to actually perform that service without going ahead and having the type of conversation you would normally want to have with the patient about whether or not the right thing to do is wrong?
So is your concern that the care becomes so subspecialized that the informed consent conversation then becomes like artificially constrained because this physician is only able to perform this type of service? Is that what you mean? Yeah, I mean, this is why I think it's so important for physicians to engage in robust informed consent discussions with patients about the services that they're willing to provide and the services that are clinically appropriate for a patient in that position. So informed consent law is actually fairly clear cut in this area, which is to satisfy your informed consent responsibilities to a patient, you either have to provide the information that a reasonable physician would disclose, that's half of the U.S. jurisdictions, or you have to provide the information that a reasonable patient would want to know. Ideally, there's overlap between those two. And so I think that answers your question in the sense that even if I'm unwilling to provide the service or I don't have the capacity, expertise, whatever, to provide the service, I have a responsibility to patients to make sure that they're aware that there are other people in the universe who might perform different services than what I'm willing to perform.
All right. Okay. Please join us and thanks, Dina. So we would just like to thank you very much. You lived up to the tremendous shoes that you needed to fill for this inaugural award, and we really appreciate you giving this lecture and being here with us.
Great, thank you.
For this event. So we wanted to present you, Charles.
Holly, on behalf of Houston Methodist, Baylor College of Medicine, and Rice University, we present you the first annual Baruch Brody Award.
Thank you.